Welcome to the first Youth Prophecy Group meeting of 2022. Let's start with opening prayer. Dear God in heaven, thank you for bringing us to the start of a new year. Help us to give you the glory this year and help us to be ready to teach the Levites. Thank you for letting YPG reach a new year and help us to understand this lesson and have a good grasp on history so we can know what happens in our time because we know history repeats. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. So as he already said, this is the first YPG of 2022. So welcome everybody. Today is January 2nd, and this is our 95th meeting.
The title of this week's lesson is The History of Radical Islam. So in this lesson, we're going to be looking at the history of radical Islam from when it started back in the 18th century all the way until one of its major leaders were killed 3 years ago.
PreReform Line, 1774. There are two main branches of Islam, Sunni and Shia. These two branches are further divided into smaller branches. The most popular of the two branches, which is Sunni Islam, is broken down into four groups. One of these groups is the Hanbali school, and this group is what Wahhabism came from. So Wahhabism formed from the Hanbali school. Wahhabism is a very conservative, radical branch in Islam. Wahhabis believe in a literal interpretation of the Quran, which is Islam's holy book. So for Christianity, we have the Bible, Islam has the Quran. So they believe in a strict interpretation of the Quran, and they want to establish a society based on these strict interpretations. They fight to return to a purer form of Islam, mainly pushing to return to its origins. Wahhabis condemn all other sources of religion and doctrine, and they see everyone else, such as Christians and Jews, as enemies. However, Wahhabi believers consider the word Wahhabism derogatory, as it is used by outsiders to distinguish the movement or the group. Wahhabis prefer to call themselves Unitarians or followers of pious forbearers. Wahhabism gets its name from its leader, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Wahhab was born in the 18th century in a place which is now Saudi Arabia. Wahhab began to promote his teachings in the district in Saudi Arabia, or region in Saudi Arabia, around 1740. Wahhab came from a family that was from the Hanbali school, so his teachings are rooted in their teachings. However, the Hanbali officials rejected his ideas and he was expelled from his region. In 1774, Wahhab arrived in another region in Saudi Arabia, and the ruler of that region, which was Muhammad ibn Saud, he liked Wahhab's teachings. From then on, Wahhab and the Saudi royal family had an alliance, and Wahhabism began to spread thanks to that alliance.
(1932). The Saudi Arabia of today really began in 1932 because in that year the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was formed. Before that year, the descendants of Wahhab that we just learned about and of Saud continued to work together to try to establish an empire. Their descendants began to be called Wahhabis. They were opposed by the Ottoman Empire and Egypt, and several of the kings or leaders were taken captive or hostage. But there was also internal struggles in this region, and local tribes and leaders wanted more power, so they would oppose them. They also thought that they had stopped practicing true Wahhabism, so they didn't want them in power. In 1901, Ibn Saud, the son of the current or the last Wahhabi leader who was exiled in Kuwait, went back to the Arabian Peninsula. In January of 1902, with only 15 soldiers, took the capital city of Ridha, which is in the red circle. That city is still the capital of Saudi Arabia today. Ibn Saud continued to fight mostly against the Ottomans and the Rashidis, who were a local tribe who wanted more power, and he wanted to unite all of the Arabian Peninsula. but he sometimes acknowledged the power of the Ottomans, and also he sometimes got help from Great Britain. In 1921, Ibn Saud proclaimed himself the leader of Najd and the surrounding areas. And Najd is an area in the middle of Saudi Arabia, or a region in the middle of Saudi Arabia. Then in 1926, he made himself the ruler of the Hejaz, which is another region in Saudi Arabia, which includes Mecca and Medina that are in the black circles. Both of those areas, though, he ruled separately. After that, he built up an army and established the government more, but some, of course, of the less powerful leaders still opposed him. Finally, on September 23rd, 1932, Ibn Saud sent out a royal decree uniting Hejaz and Najd and the surrounding areas and making himself the leader, and he united them into one kingdom. He named this new territory the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and that's still the name today, although we usually just say Saudi Arabia. After that, other countries began to recognize him as a legitimate country. It's a monarchy, so his descendants have reigned absolutely over this country ever since. And just like in the past, Saudi Arabia, or the leaders of Saudi Arabia, are still in an alliance with Wahhabism, so the royal family has to support that extreme form of Islam in order to appear qualified to control their kingdom, especially because it contains Mecca and Medina.
In 1938, an oil well was set up in Saudi Arabia. It would later become identified as the largest source of oil in the world. The name of that oil field was Safaniya. Saudi Arabia decided to sell that oil that they were harvesting to the West. Now, this is where the problem arises. Saudi Arabia is an extremely conservative country, and then, because of the oil they were selling, they also became extremely wealthy. It is now the 15th richest country in the world because of its oil production. And because they became wealthy, they could further the spread of Wahhabism. The oil fields allow for greater spread of Wahhabism in the world.
The 144,000 Reform Line. So from 1979 to 1989, 4 key events in 4 different countries took place. So we're going to begin with Pakistan, which is the country on the map in the blue. On July 5th, 1977, Zia-ul-Haq staged a coup on Pakistan's government and overthrew it. Then he imposed martial law on the country. Zia was the head of Pakistan's army, and he had Wahhabi leanings. What Zia did next from 1977 to 1989 was the Islamization of the country. Zia imposed Sharia law, and Sharia law is a law based on the Quran, so it's Islamic law. So he opposed Sharia law on Pakistan's laws, making them more religious. In 1980, Zia established the Federal Sharia Court, which is a federal court based on Sharia law. In 1986, Zia amended Pakistan's blasphemy laws to make crimes against Muhammad, the founder of Islam, punishable by death. Now, Muhammad has been dead for a while, but like if they blaspheme him, they're going to be punished by death. However, Zia was an ally of the United States. When the USSR invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan went into an alliance to help fund the Mujahideen and fight the USSR. So next event from 1979 to 89 was Iran, and Iran's the country in the red. The Iranian Revolution began in 1978, in January. So in January of 1978, an Iranian newspaper under direction of the Shah, which is the monarch of Iran, disparaged I'm just gonna say his last name, Khomeini, or I'm not sure if you consider it a last name since it's a different country, but anyway, Khomeini. So the Shah's newspaper disparaged Khomeini, and Khomeini was a religious leader that had been exiled since 1963 for opposing the Shah. Thousands of people in Iran protested the Shah's action. On September 8, 1979, the Shah declared martial law and security killed 100 protesters in Iran's capital. In December of 1978, protests all over the country demanded the removal of the Shah and the return of Khomeini. In January 12, 1979, Khomeini formed the Revolutionary Council to help get him in power. On January 16th, the Shah and his family left Iran and went to Egypt for a quote-unquote vacation. On February 1st, Khomeini returned to Iran and he was greeted by millions in the capital. And he automatically became the de facto leader of Iran since, the leader was gone and everybody liked him better anyway. 3 days later, Khomeini appointed a prime minister for his interim government. On February 11, 1979, the remainder of Shah's government collapsed, and in early December, Khomeini's new constitution was approved. Lastly, on January 25, 1980, Iran's first president was elected. So Khomeini didn't make himself the president, but he made somebody else the president. And once the new government was in place, it got to work enforcing Islam on the country. The new government replaced the Shah's modern legal system, which was a secular system, with a legal system which is based on Sharia law. So after the Iranian Revolution, Iran's government went from secular to a theocracy. And next we have Afghanistan in the green. The Soviet-Afghan War began in 1979 when two sides were fighting for control of the country. On September 4, 1979, Nur Mohammad Taraki, the president of Afghanistan, was killed by his second-in-command, admin. People rebelled against Taraki for overthrowing the president before him, but even though he was killed, the rebellion still didn't end. It only grew. On December 24, 1979, the USSR sent some troops into the capital of Afghanistan at night. They were originally there to help Taraki, but on December 27th, they ended up killing him, and they put Babrak Karmal as the new leader of Afghanistan. And on that day, they also sent 100,000 soldiers into Afghanistan as well.
They killed Amin. Taraki was already dead.
Oh, did I say Taraki? Yeah.
Yes.
They killed Amin because Amin killed Taraki and replaced him, and they killed Amin. They were originally there to help him. Well, it depends on if they're really coming to help him, but he had called them to help them, but they ended up killing Amin and replacing him. So, violent demonstrations began against the Soviets and their Soviet leader, who was leading Afghanistan, Karmal. The USSR began to take control of Afghanistan next, but they were resisted by the Mujahideen, which is a title that many Afghan guerrilla groups took. Civil war continued in the country until February 15, 1989, when the USSR withdrew its troops, but there was still a civil war between the communist government they had set up and the Mujahideen. This was a proxy war because, well, no, that's not the proxy war. The proxy war was the Soviet Civil War. And it was a proxy war because the USSR was funding the communist government and the United States, among other countries, were funding the Mujahideen. So it had been a proxy war. And lastly, Saudi Arabia had significant events in 1979 to 89. In 1979, Saudi Arabia became more religious. On November 20, 1979, 500 Saudi extremists took control of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. These extremists demanded the overthrow of the Saudi royal family, saying they were controlled by the West and they had betrayed Islam. We know how in previous paragraphs we saw that they started selling oil to the West and making a lot of money. So these extremists thought that the West was controlling them and they had betrayed true Islam. They were just care about money. 2 weeks later, the terrorists were removed from the mosque, but the royal family next had to prove that they were still religious, so they pushed Wahhabism more strongly. They started sending billions of dollars to radical Wahhabi preachers, and they also set up religious schools along Pakistan's border. In 1985, a Wahhabi translation of the Quran began to be printed, millions of copies per year. This Quran, which is called the Noble Quran, is the most widespread Quran in the English-speaking world today. This is what Saudi Arabia was doing in 1979. So as we see, from 1979 to the 1980s, 4 key events took place in the Middle East in these 4 countries on the screen.
(1986 and 1988). So as we saw, the Soviet war in Afghanistan is connected to both Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, because it's on the border of Afghanistan, and Afghanistan itself. So because of that war, Muslims from all over the world were going to Afghanistan to help fight because they don't like the USSR. Saudi Arabia saw this as a good opportunity, and that's why they sent a lot of conservative Islamic teachers to Pakistan, to the border, so that they can basically indoctrinate the people as they were going to and from Afghanistan. And this is why they set up all of those schools along the border, to teach people about Wahhabism and thus to make them seem like they're legitimate rulers. This worked, and many extremists were educated at those schools, including some people that helped found the Taliban. Close to the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan is a town called Peshawar, and that's circled in red. And that town played a big role in this history. One of the teachers there was a man called Azam, and he was an extremely conservative Sunni Muslim scholar who was considered the founder of global jihad, or basically terrorism. While he was there, he invited one of his friends, Osama bin Laden, to join him. Bin Laden was from Saudi Arabia and he followed Wahhabism, but he had been in Afghanistan supporting the Mujahideen in the Soviet-Afghan War since it had started in 1979. In 1986, he decided to go to Pakistan to meet with Azam, and he went to Peshawar, of course. While there, bin Laden set up bases and trained fighters for the war in Afghanistan. And by 1988, he had formed Al-Qaeda, a Sunni Muslim terrorist group out of the fighters that he had been training. When the Soviet-Afghan War was over, all the people went home. So in 1989, Osama bin Laden also went back to Saudi Arabia. And the people of that region thought he was a hero because he had fought in the war, even though he actually did not fight that much. He was mostly just supporting the people that fought, but still, he was considered a hero. So he went back with a lot of his fighters, and he offered to use his Al-Qaeda fighters that he had trained to protect Saudi Arabia against Iraq, which is not on the map. But Iraq had just been in a war with Iran, and then Iraq started a war with Kuwait. So Saudi Arabia was a bit scared, but Saudi Arabia refused his help anyway. They actually were scared of Wahhabism, and they didn't follow it strictly themselves. So they didn't want Al-Qaeda, which was fighters who were trained and who believed in Wahhabism. They didn't want them in their country protecting them, or supposed to be protecting them. So instead, Saudi Arabia invited the United States to help them. And bin Laden, of course, did not like that at all. And he criticized the Saudi government. So in 1991, he was forced to flee with his fighters. And he went to Afghanistan and then to Sudan in 1992. And in Sudan, he continued to enlarge Al-Qaeda.
By 1996, Osama bin Laden was back in Afghanistan. In the same year, on August 23rd, he declared war on the United States. Quoting, on August 23rd, 1996, Osama bin Laden declared war on the United States. Within a few months of his arrival to Afghanistan, he issued a 30-page document, which is called the Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Places. And it was published in a London-based newspaper and faxed to supporters around the world. It was bin Laden's first public call for a global jihad against the United States. His central lament was the presence of U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia, or the occupation of the land of the two holiest sites. That's from The Atlantic. His main grievance with the United States was that they had troops in Saudi Arabia. This was why he launched a war against them, the first phase from 1996 to 2001. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda under Osama bin Laden attacked the United States and killed nearly 3,000 people. The United States invaded Afghanistan in retaliation.
The Iraq War. So in 2003, the Iraq War began. But previous to 2003, in 1998, the United States was worried about the perils posed by Iraq. They focused on the worst case scenario where Iraq might might obtain nuclear weapons and attack the United States. However, at the time, this wasn't one of their major concerns. But after 9/11, the United States became very concerned about Iraq having nuclear weapons and about the leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein. Now, Iraq really didn't have anything, they didn't have anything to do with 9/11, but the United States still didn't like Iraq in the first place, so they set about trying to connect Al Qaeda or make reasons to invade Iraq. So Iraq really wasn't guilty of 9/11, they weren't, but the United States wanted to make a reason for invading Iraq. So the United States sent the Secretary of State Colin Powell to the United Nations to get permission to go to war with with Iraq. So we know that the United Nations is grouped many countries in the world, and you actually have to get permission by the United Nations to invade another country. You can't just invade on your own, at least countries shouldn't. Powell's argument of invasion was that al-Zakari, which is another extremist connected to al-Qaeda, was in Iraq, and therefore Saddam Hussein must be helping al-Zakari train al-Qaeda fighters. Powell also gave other evidence that Saddam Hussein was hiding weapons of mass destruction. But of course, this wasn't completely true. There was no evidence that Iraq's government, Saddam Hussein, was harboring al-Qaeda. And al-Zakari was in Iraq, but he was in the northern part of Iraq that Saddam Hussein didn't control. He was there on purpose. And also, the United Nations have been searching Iraq for weapons they weren't supposed to have. They did find weapons that were illegal, but they didn't find any weapons of mass destruction. But regardless of not getting United Nations approval, the United States invaded Iraq on March 17, 2003. No, they didn't. On March 17, 2003, the United States gave Saddam Hussein a 48 ultimatum telling them to leave the country. 48-hour ultimatum. But Saddam Hussein didn't leave within 48 hours, so on March 20th, 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. They started blowing up bunkers where Saddam Hussein was supposed to be, but of course they didn't kill him, and later they invaded troops into the country. Probably the major mistake the United States made while they invaded Iraq was how they treated the Iraq army. They dissolved the Iraq army, and with no leader, all the soldiers went and joined extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda. This created a vacuum in Iraq that extremists were willing to fill. The war in Iraq lasted 8 years until December 15, 2011, when the invasion of Iraq officially ended. In the picture, you have some soldiers in Iraq.
Shortly after the Iraq War began, another terrorist organization was formed. That organization was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI for short. This group was formed by al-Zakari, which is the one on the screen. Al-Zakari was from the country of Jordan, and he was troublesome when he was younger, and so he was in jail often. Then he went to Afghanistan to fight in the Soviet-Afghan War from 1979 to 1989, but he got there a bit too late, so he didn't do that much fighting. In Afghanistan, though, he worked as a journalist, but he was still a criminal, so he ended up in jail again. When in jail, he became radical and more violent. Al-Zakari was released in 1999, and some people think that he met Osama bin Laden personally shortly after that. Al-Zakari then started a camp to train terrorists because he was an extremist by this time. And he started that camp in a region of Afghanistan. He was also in charge of several small terrorist groups. After the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, al-Zakari and his main group began to conduct terrorist attacks there because they didn't like the United States. And he didn't like the United States being involved in Iraq, and he also didn't like the local governments there either. Then in 2004, he formally joined Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda and renamed his group Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So before it didn't have that name, and there was more than one group, but it became Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2004. But he did not get along very well with bin Laden because bin Laden was more focused on foreign countries like attacking the United States, but he was more focused on local governments. Al-Zakari also had an extreme hatred of Shiite Muslims, which Osama bin Laden, although he didn't like them, of course, because he was Sunni, but he didn't hate them nearly as much as Al-Zakari did. Al-Zakari also did terrorist attacks purposely to try to start a Sunni Shiite civil war. Al-Zakari also often didn't listen to Al-Qaeda, and his group was responsible for numerous violent attacks against government workers and also against ordinary people. At first, radical Sunni Muslim groups in Iraq supported Al-Zakari, but that slowly disappeared when they saw how he was so violent and that his group also had a lot of non-Iraqi people in it. In 2006, Al-Zakari was killed by the United States, but his group, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, continued to operate, although it was very weak.
In 2011, Arab Springs began the Syrian civil war. Quoting from history, the Arab Springs was a series of pro-democracy uprisings that developed several largely Muslim countries. Similarly, the civil war in Syria began in the aftermath of Arab Spring. End quote. The Syrian civil war had two fighting sides: the government under the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad against the rebels. Most countries sided with the rebels against Assad. To solve that problem, he released a lot of prisoners from Syrian jails, knowing they'd all go to the side of the rebels. With criminals such as terrorists on the side of the rebels, it was harder for other countries to support them. The following year, in 2012, the Al-Qaeda branch in Iraq, AQI, changed its name to the Islamic State in Iraq, ISI.
In Syria.
What?
Oh, never. No.
ISI, and started disconnecting themselves from Al-Qaeda. During the Syrian civil war, when Assad freed a lot of the prisoners, ISI brought them into their group. They also contributed to freeing some of the prisoners during 2012 and 2013 by raiding jails. They thereafter changed their name to ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, in 2013 because of all the Syrians that joined them from prison.
The 2014 Caliphate. On April 11, 2012, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, which was the leader of ISI at the time, went from Iraq to Syria. He renamed ISI, like we just saw, he renamed it to Iraq, let me start over. He renamed ISI to ISIS, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. He was combining ISI with another group called Jabhat al-Nusra, or JN for short. And JN he had sent to Syria a few years earlier, back in 2012. The leader of JN actually rejected the combination of two groups, but Baghdadi had more power and more people just left JN and joined ISIS. In 2003 or 13, July of 2013, ISIS performed its Breaking the Walls campaign, where it conducted bombings and prison breaks. On July 21st, 2013, which is a significant date in this movement, July 21st, ISIS launched its Soldiers Harvest campaign, and it did that campaign to capture territory and decline the Iraqi army. From August to December of 2013, ISIS began to attack other rival groups and take control of more land in Iraq and Syria, or just the Iraq. In January of 2014, ISIS took control of Raqqa, Raqqa is a city in Syria, and it declared that the capital of its territory, the capital of the ISIS Emirates. In February, Al-Qaeda officially cut ties with ISIS. We know that ISIS cut ties with Al-Qaeda when they renamed their group, but later they officially cut ties in February of 2014. From February to June 2014, ISIS took control of more territory in Iraq and Syria. On June 29, 2014, ISIS established a caliphate on the land it controlled in Iraq and Syria and renamed their name to the Islamic State, so it's just IS. They also proclaimed their leader, al-Baghdadi, as caliph. So a caliphate is an Islamic institution that controls a certain territory. Its leader is called a caliph and is considered the religious successor of Muhammad and the ruler of all Muslims. At its peak, the caliphate controlled between 39,000 and 42,000 square miles, which is about one-third of Syria and 40% of Iraq. And in the picture, we see the black part is how much land the ISIS caliphate controlled, or the Islamic State, since it weren't ISIS anymore. So when they controlled their territory, ISIS ruled it very harshly. ISIS, who was Sunni, targeted Shiites and other non-Sunnis, attacking their homes, taking spoils, as well as taxing them and forcing them to convert on pain of death. In September of 2014, ISIS attacked a city in Syria called Kobani, in which almost all the people in that city fled to Turkey because they were afraid of ISIS. ISIS fought the United States and the Kurds over the city in what is called the Siege of Kobani. At the end, the US airstrikes allowed the Kurdish army to regain control of the city. This defeat is marked by many as the beginning steps that led to the end of the ISIS caliphate.
So ISIS caliphate actually reached its height, or the most territory it ever covered, in 2015, but it was always in danger and it was continuously being attacked by the armies of Iraq and Syria, other countries, like we just said, with the help of the United States, with the United States being one of the other countries that helped, and other groups like the Kurds. By 2016, the caliphate started to decline, and in March of 2019, they lost the town, which was their last significant piece of territory. Later in 2019, the leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, was killed. That's him in the picture. After the ISIS caliphate began, everyone had been looking for him, but for the last few years, he had not been very visible, only occasionally giving out audio or video recordings of him, telling people to do stuff. So they had been looking for him, but they didn't. Well, okay, they've been looking for him. Then in October of 2019, the United States found out where he was hiding and they decided to attack. He was in a walled complex in northwestern Syria with several other people, and he had been planning to go somewhere else, but he didn't get there yet. On October 27th at night, 8 military helicopters flew for about an hour to the compound. The soldiers then attacked the compound after first telling people to come out, and some people actually did come out. A few people died, but all of the soldiers were okay. Al-Baghdadi went into a tunnel and killed himself, and his body was almost immediately identified and then buried at sea. The soldiers also destroyed the compound where he had been, so people wouldn't say like this was a sacred place. This is where Baghdadi was last. So they made sure they completely destroyed it. The soldiers, former President Trump, who was the president at this time, watched the operation live in the White House, and then he began to brag and boast about it. On October 31st, ISIS confirmed that al-Baghdadi was dead, but they also announced that they had a new leader. So at this point, there were around 14,000 ISIS fighters still in Syria and Iraq. And although ISIS leader was gone and their caliphate was over and they were severely weakened, they were not defeated by the death of al-Baghdadi.
So in summary, this is the line of the history of radical Islam. It all began in 1744 when Wahhabism began to spread throughout what is now Saudi Arabia with the help of the Saud royal family. In 1932, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was officially formed. In 1938, the world's largest offshore source of oil was found in Saudi Arabia. So that's when the Saudi royal family started to get rich and started selling their oil to the West and stuff like that. In 1979 to 1989, 4 significant events happened. There was the Soviet-Afghan War, which was a proxy war between the United States and other countries and the Soviet Union. And during that war, the communist government was fighting against the Mujahideen. And also in 1979, there was Sharia law introduced in Pakistan. There was Sharia law introduced in Iran. And in Saudi Arabia, they had to start pushing Wahhabism a bit more strongly because extremists started to say they were controlled by the West and weren't really true Islamics anymore. In 1986 and 88, Osama bin Laden formed Al Qaeda, and in 1996, he officially declared war on the United States. And we know he declared war on the United States because Saudi Arabia chose to get US help instead of his Al Qaeda help, and he didn't like that. So he declared war on the United States. In 2001, he attacked the United States in what we all know as the 9/11 terrorist attack, which is interesting because before we all knew he attacked the United States, but you really get why he attacked the United States when we look at history. So that is how one thing history can teach us about events that happened recently. In 2003, even though Iraq wasn't connected to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the United States conjured up a way to make it seem like Iraq was connected to Al Qaeda just so they could invade Iraq because they didn't like its president and they didn't want him to get nuclear weapons. In 2004, Al Qaeda in Iraq was officially formed, and in 2011, Al Qaeda in Iraq changed its name to Islamic State in Iraq, and they later changed that again to Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. In 2004, the Islamic State in Iraq, or ISIS,
14.
in 2014, ISIS had its height of power when it had its caliphate controlling a lot of Syria and Iraq. But in 2019, its leader was killed, and even though they got a new leader, they were still weakened. But they still have some fighters in Iraq and Syria. And this is the line of radical Islam. We talked about the Taliban, which was also involved in this history in lesson 89, if you want to look into that. But Taliban isn't radical, it's more just
Was it
crazy.
terrorist?
They're not terrorists, they're just kind of radical. Yeah. Mhm. You can.
I was gonna say, does anybody have any questions or comments?
Oh.
You can say it or type it in the chat. Okay.
So now it is quiz time. Mm, You did not see that. The first question: when was the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia formed? When was the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia formed? G. And that is correct. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was formed in 1993.
32.
1932, sorry. Next question. In what year did Osama bin Laden declare war on the United States and why?
Not is it? Oh. Oh, I see.
F. Yes. Osama bin Laden declared war on the United States in 1996 because the US had troops in Saudi Arabia, but more specifically because the Saudi Arabia chose the help of the United States instead of him.
And because he didn't want the US controlling the two holy sites, which is Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia, which Islam thinks are holy sites. I don't know specifically what they are.
There are cities where Muhammad was, I think, where he lived a lot of time. Of course, the United States didn't control them; they were just in Saudi Arabia, but still.
Mm-hmm.
Next question. Who created AQY that thereafter became ISIS? Who created AQY that thereafter became ISIS? H. And that is correct. Al-Zakari. Next question. When was the caliphate formed? What year was the caliphate formed? When was the caliphate formed? Let's see. And yes, the ISIS caliphate was formed in 2014. Last question. What were the 4 countries that 4 major events took place in from 1978 to 1989?
1979.
Yeah. Yes. And
What were the 4 countries that 4 major events took place in from 1979 to 1989? Okay. And yes, that is correct. The 4 countries were Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Afghanistan. So congratulations, everybody. Perfect score.
so thank you everybody for coming or watching. If you want notes, videos, or updates or recordings, which is videos, you can contact us at youthprophecygroup@gmail.com. And the next meeting will be on January 16th, 2022. And also, if you want to find any previous,
Thank you.
you're welcome. I was going to say, if you're going to find any previous notes, videos, recordings, you can go to youthprophecygroup.org.
Let's close with prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us to this new year of 2022. Thank you for calling us to be part of the 144,000, and thank you for letting us be able to understand where we are in history and know what is coming in the future, and also be able to understand what's happened in the past. Please be with us throughout this year, and specifically today, help us to glorify you. And thank you for providing for all of our needs and for keeping us all safe. In Christ's name, amen.
Thank you for coming to
Bye.
the first meeting of the year.
Yes, bye.
For watching.
Thank you for coming.